People who do not know the mysteries of heaven may believe that angels exist apart from us and that we exist apart from angels, but I can solemnly testify on the basis of all my experience of heaven and my conversations with angels that no angel or spirit exists apart from humankind and that no human being exists apart from angels and spirits. I can testify also that the way we are joined together is mutual and reciprocal. This leads to the prime conclusion that humankind and the heaven of angels make up a single whole and depend on each other mutually and reciprocally for their existence, which means that neither can be parted from the other. Humankind is the seedbed of heaven. This assertion will be further supported in the next chapter, where I will be showing that heaven and hell come from humankind, which means that humankind is the seedbed of heaven. As a preface to that, here I will state that just as heaven has been formed from humankind thus far, that is, since the beginning of creation, so it will continue being formed and enriched from now on. Now, it is within the realm of possibility that humankind on a given planet could perish. This occurs if humankind completely separates itself from the divine, because in that case people no longer have any spiritual life, only an earthly life like that of animals. Once people are like this, they cannot be formed into a community and restrained by the bonds of law, because without an inflow from heaven, that is, without being governed by the divine, people become insane and, forsaking all self-control, plunge into every kind of unspeakable behavior toward each other. But even if humankind were to perish on one planet by separating itself from the divine, an outcome the Lord provides against, it would still continue on others. There are hundreds of thousands of inhabited planets in the universe. See my booklet, The Earth-like bodies called planets in our solar system and in deep space. I have been told by a heavenly source that if the Lord had not come into the world, taken on a human nature on this planet, and made that nature divine, humankind on this planet would have died off and left not a single survivor today. I have also been told that the same thing would have happened if the Lord had not given us the kind of word we have, which serves as a foundation for the angelic heaven and a way of joining it to us. However, the truth of this can be grasped only by people who think spiritually, that is, people who are joined to heaven through their acknowledgement of the divine nature in the Lord, since they are the only ones who can do this kind of thinking. The full extent of heaven, which exists for the Sarche of angels, is so vast that it cannot be filled to eternity. In support of this, see the book Heaven and Hell, particularly the chapter on the vastness of heaven. Heaven's perfection increases as the number of its inhabitants increases. This follows from its form, which determines the patterns in which people associate and the ways communication flows there. Heaven's form is the most perfect form of all, and in the case of the most perfect form, the more people there are, the more there is a shared motion toward oneness among them, and they are therefore joined together more closely and harmoniously. The harmony and consequent joining together increase as the numbers increase, because each new constituent there is placed between two or more others in order to connect them together, and therefore the new element provides strength and connection. Heaven's form is like the form of the human mind, whose perfection grows as the mind gains more goodness and truth, leading to greater intelligence and wisdom. The reason the form of a human mind devoted to heavenly wisdom and intelligence is like the form of heaven is that a mind like this is in fact a miniature image of heaven's form. That is why, both for people like this and for angels, there is such complete communication of their thoughts and feelings regarding what is good and true with the communities of heaven that surround them. That communication extends farther into heaven the more their wisdom grows, that is, the more varied are the kinds of knowledge of truth that have taken root in their understanding, and the greater is the abundance of desires to do good that have taken root in their will. In other words, it depends on what has taken root in their minds, because the mind consists of the understanding and the will. It is the nature of the human and angelic mind that it can be enriched more and more to eternity, and as it is enriched, it is perfected. This happens especially when people are being led by the Lord, because then they are introduced to genuinely true thoughts that become rooted in their understanding, and to genuinely good desires that become rooted in their will, since the Lord is arranging everything in this kind of mind into a form of heaven so completely that eventually it becomes a heaven in miniature. This comparison makes it possible for us to see that the increase in the number of angels perfects heaven, because the situation in that case is much the same. Every form is made up of varied elements. A form that is not made up of varied elements is not really a form at all, because it has no characteristics and is incapable of undergoing changes of state. The characteristics of any form are determined by the way its constituent elements are related to each other, the way they interact with each other, and the way they agree to be one, which factors determine the extent to which any form is regarded as a single entity. The nature of a form is such that the more constituent elements there are that are arranged in a given way within it, the more perfect it is, because as just stated, each of its constituents strengthens, reinforces, interconnects, and thus perfects it. These facts can be better confirmed, though, by material presented in the book Heaven and Hell, especially where it deals with the fact that each community of heaven is a heaven in smaller form and each angel a heaven in smallest form, where it treats of heaven's form, which determines how people associate and communicate there, and where it treats of the wisdom of heaven's angels. Every divine work aims at what is infinite and eternal. This is shown by many things that occur both in heaven and in this world. In both, there is never anything that is exactly like or identical to anything else. There is never a face exactly like or identical to any other, and there never will be to eternity. By the same token, there is no one whose character is exactly like that of anyone else, as many people as there are, and the same is true for angels as well. That is how many different faces and different characters there are. Despite the fact that there are countless parts that constitute the body and countless feelings that constitute the lower mind, no one person ever has anything exactly like or identical to what is within anyone else. That is why every individual leads a life that differs from the life of everyone else. The same holds true throughout the physical world and in all its details. The cause underlying such an infinite variety in absolutely everything is that everything originates in the divine, and the divine is infinite. That is why there is some image of the infinite everywhere, so that the divine will look upon everything as its own handiwork, and everything, being the work of the divine, will look toward the divine. To illustrate how everything in the physical world looks toward what is infinite and eternal, let us take just the following rather mundane example. Every seed, whether it is from a fruit tree, a grain, or a flower, has been created in such a way that it could multiply to infinity and go on forever. One seed leads to many more, 5, 10, 20, or even 100, and each of these leads in turn to as many more. Let this fruitfulness from a single seed continue unchecked each year, and in just 100 years it could fill not only the whole surface of this earth but the surfaces of tens of thousands of earths. By the same token, these types of vegetation have been created to go on forever. This shows us then how they contain an image of what is infinite and eternal, and it is the same in all other cases as well. The heaven of angels is the reason why everything in the universe was created, because a heaven of angels is the reason for humankind, and humankind is the reason for the heavens we see above us and the planets they contain. So this divine work, the heaven of angels, looks above all toward what is infinite and eternal, and therefore looks toward multiplying without end, because heaven is where the divine itself dwells. We can conclude from this that humankind will never come to an end, because if it did, the divine work would come to a halt at a specific quantity and would cease to look toward infinity. Heaven and hell come from humankind. The Christian world is totally ignorant of the fact that heaven and hell come from humankind. People believe that angels were created at the beginning and that this was the origin of heaven. They believe that the devil or Satan was an angel of light who was cast out with his gang because he became a rebel, and that was the origin of hell. Angels are utterly astounded that this is what the Christian world believes, and even more astounded that people know absolutely nothing about heaven, even though this should be central to what the church is teaching. Because this kind of ignorance has become dominant, angels rejoice at heart that it has now pleased the Lord to reveal a great deal about heaven and also about hell, and by this means to dispel as much as possible the darkness that has been increasing every day because the church has reached its end. So they want me to assure you on their behalf that there is not one angel in all heaven who was created an angel from the beginning, and that there is no devil in hell who was created an angel of light and cast down. No, all the people in heaven and all the people in hell have come from humankind. The ones in heaven are the ones who lived lives of heavenly love and faith while in the world, and the ones in hell are the ones who lived lives of hellish love and faith. Further, what is called the devil and Satan actually refers to hell as a whole. The devil means the back area of hell, where people called evil demons live, and Satan means the front area of hell, where people called evil spirits live. On the nature of each of these hells, see toward the end of my book Heaven and Hell. Why has the Christian world seized on this belief about the people in heaven and the people in hell? Angels have told me that it comes from a few passages in the Word understood only in their literal meaning and not illuminated and explained by means of a genuine body of teaching drawn from the Word, when in fact if the real body of teaching of the Church does not light the way, the literal meaning of the Word leads the mind astray in a variety of directions, causing ignorance, heresies, and errors. Another reason people in the church have these ideas is that they believe no one will get to heaven or hell before the last judgment, and the picture of the last judgment they have adopted is that everything visible to the eye is going to be destroyed, that new things will come into being, and that souls will be reunited to their bodies, allowing people to live as human beings again. This belief goes along with another, namely, a belief in angels as beings created in the beginning, since you cannot believe that heaven and hell are from humankind when you believe that no human being will get to heaven or hell until the end of the world. To convince people that this is not the case, I have been allowed to meet with angels and have conversations with people in hell. I have been engaged in this interaction for many years now, sometimes without interruption from morning to evening, and in this way I have been taught about heaven and hell. This has happened so that people of the church will no longer remain in their misconceived beliefs about a resurrection on Judgment Day, about the state of souls in the meanwhile, and about the nature of angels and the devil. Because these beliefs are false, they are full of darkness, and for people who base their thinking about these matters on a sense of their own intelligence, these beliefs lead to doubt and ultimately to denial. They say in their hearts, How can such a vast heaven with so many stars, with the sun and the moon, be destroyed and disintegrate? How can stars then fall to earth from heaven, stars that are larger than the earth is? How can bodies that have been eaten by worms, devoured by rot, or scattered to the winds be reassembled and reattached to their souls, and where have these souls been in the meanwhile? What kind of experience have these souls been having without the physical senses they had in their bodies? These and many similar questions, because they are incomprehensible, are not believable, for many. They even destroy belief in our eternal life, in heaven and hell, and in all the rest of the principles of the Church's faith. We can see this destruction taking place in people who say, "Who has come from heaven and told us that this is true?" What is hell? Does it actually exist? What is this business of people being tormented by fire to eternity? What is the Judgment Day? Haven't people been waiting in vain for it for centuries? All this and more, leading to a rejection of everything. To prevent people who think this way, as most people do who are held to be learned and well educated because they have worldly expertise, from further distressing and misleading people of simple faith and heart and bringing about hellish darkness in regard to God, heaven, eternal life, and related matters, the Lord has opened the deeper levels of my spirit. This has made it possible for me to talk after their deaths with all the people I have ever known during their physical lives. With some of these I have talked for days, with some for months, with some for a whole year. I have also talked with so many other people that saying there were 100,000 of them would be an understatement. Many of these were in the heavens and many were in the hells. I have talked with some people on the third day after they died, and have told them that arrangements were being made for their burial and funeral, which prompted them to say that they had done well in casting off what had served them for a body and its functions in the world. They wanted me to tell their loved ones that they were not dead but alive, and were just as human now as ever. They said they had simply crossed over from one world into another and had no awareness of having lost anything, since they had a body and sensory faculties just as they had had before. They had understanding and will just as before. They had the same kinds of thoughts and feelings, the same kinds of sensations, even the same kinds of pleasures and desires as they had had in the world. Many who have just died, on seeing that they are still people and are still alive as they were before, and in similar circumstances, since for all of us, our first state after death is much like the one we had in the world, though this changes gradually for us into either heaven or hell, are touched with a new joy at being alive and say they had not believed it would be like this. They are also absolutely amazed that they had been so ignorant and blind about what happens to us after death, and are even more amazed that people in the Church have the same ignorance and blindness, even though they of all people on the planet have access to light on such matters. Then they begin for the first time to see the reason for this blindness and ignorance, that outward concerns, worldly and bodily preoccupations, had so completely taken over and filled their minds that they could not be raised into heaven's light and look beyond the things they had been taught, and so see what the Church is really all about. When bodily and worldly things are loved as much as they are nowadays, nothing but utter darkness flows in from them when we try to think about heavenly realities beyond the teachings on faith proclaimed by our Church. A great many of the learned from the Christian world are dumbfounded when after they die they find themselves having bodies, wearing clothes, and living in houses just as they did in the world. When they are reminded of what they had thought about life after death, the soul, spirits, and heaven and hell, they feel embarrassed and ashamed. They say that their thought had been foolish and that ordinary people had been far wiser in their beliefs than they were. Some scholars who had convinced themselves of such beliefs and had attributed everything to nature were examined, and it turned out that the outer levels of their minds were opened but the inner levels were closed. This meant that they did not look toward heaven but toward the world and therefore toward hell, since to the extent that the deeper levels of our minds are opened, we look toward heaven, while to the extent that the inner levels are closed and the outer are opened, we look toward hell. The inner levels of our minds are formed to be receptive to all things of heaven and the outer levels are formed to be receptive to all things of this world. But if we are receptive to the world and not at the same time to heaven, then we are receptive to hell. As for human spirits being people and having a similar form after separation from the body, daily experience over many years has supplied me with evidence of this, since I have seen them, heard them, and talked with them thousands of times. I have even talked with them about the fact that people in this world do not believe that they exist and that the learned dismiss as simple-minded those who do believe. The spirits are heartsick that this kind of ignorance still prevails on our globe and especially within the church. They say that this kind of belief emanates especially from the learned who think about the soul on the basis of what they sense with their physical bodies. On this basis, they cannot conceive of the soul as being anything but thought, and this, regarded apart from any subject in which and from which it exists, is to them like some volatile substance made of pure ether, which cannot help but evaporate when the body dies. However, since the Church, on the basis of the Word, believes in the immortality of the soul, these thinkers have to attribute to the soul some touch of life, just as they do to thought. Still, though, they do not credit it with any human sensitive faculty until it is once again joined to its body. Their teachings about resurrection are founded on this premise, and so is their belief that soul and body will be reunited when the last judgment comes. What other conclusion could they come to, given their hypothesis about the soul and the need to combine it with the Church's teachings concerning eternal life? That is why when people think about the soul on the basis of both that hypothesis and those teachings, they do not grasp at all that the soul is the spirit and that it is in a human form. The result is that hardly anyone nowadays knows what anything spiritual is, let alone that people who are spiritual, meaning all angels and spirits, have a form that is human. That is why almost all the people who arrive from the world are absolutely amazed to discover that they are alive and that they are just as human as ever, no different at all. Once they get past their amazement at that, then they are astounded that the Church has no idea that this is what happens to people after death, in spite of the fact that all the people who have ever lived in this world are there in the other life, leading human lives. They also wonder why people in this world have not been informed of this by means of visions. They are told by a heavenly source that this could have been done. Nothing is easier when the Lord so pleases, but people who have convinced themselves of these misconceptions to the contrary would still not believe, even if they saw the visions for themselves. These newcomers are also told that it is dangerous to disclose anything from heaven to people who have built their lives around worldly and bodily preoccupations, because they might believe at first but later reject and thereby profane the truth. Profanation is first believing something and then rejecting it. People who commit profanation are pushed down into the lowest and harshest of all the hells. This is the danger the Lord meant when he said, "He has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, so that they would not see with their eyes and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them." John 12:40. The Lord also indicated that people who have devoted their lives to worldly and bodily loves will not believe no matter what. Abraham said to the rich man in hell, "They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them." But he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone comes to them from the dead they will be converted." But Abraham said to him, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, they will not believe even if someone rises from the dead." Luke 16:29, 30, 31. Another argument to support the fact that heaven comes from humankind is that angelic minds and human minds are very much alike. Both enjoy the faculties of understanding, perception, and will. Both are formed to be receptive to heaven, since the human mind is just as capable of wisdom as the angelic mind is. However, the reason the mind is not as wise in this world is that it lives in an earthly body. In such a body our spiritual mind does its thinking in an earthly way, because spiritual thinking, which we possess just as angels do, flows down into earthly concepts that correspond to spiritual ones and becomes perceptible to us in that way. It is different, though, when our mind is released from its ties to the physical body. Then we do not think in an earthly fashion anymore but think spiritually, and when we think spiritually we have thoughts that are incomprehensible and inexpressible to the earthly self, that is, we think like angels. We can tell from this that our inner self, which is called our spirit, is in its essence an angel. On angels being in perfect human form, see Heaven and Hell 73, 77. When our inner self is not open upward, however, but only downward, then although it is still in a human form after its release from the body, that form is dreadful and demonic. This is because it cannot look up toward heaven, only down toward hell. The Church could have known from the word that heaven and hell come from humankind, and could have made this part of its teachings, if it had let some light in from heaven and taken note of the Lord's words to the criminal, that today he would be with him in paradise, Luke 23:43. It could have noted what the Lord said about the rich man and Lazarus, that the rich man went to hell and spoke from there to Abraham, and that Abraham was in heaven, Luke 16:19, 31, and what the Lord said to the Sadducees about the resurrection, that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, Matthew 22:32. It could also have considered the belief common to all people who are living good lives, especially the belief they have when they are nearing death and are no longer preoccupied with worldly and physical concerns. They believe that they are about to enter heaven as soon as they leave their bodily life. This is the predominant view that we all have, except at those moments when we are basing our thinking on the Church's teaching regarding resurrection at the time of the Last Judgment. Ask people whether this is the case or not, and you will see. Anyone well informed about the divine design can understand that we were created to become angels because the final step in the divine design is in us. In us something of heavenly and angelic wisdom can take form, become whole, and multiply. The divine design never stops halfway down and forms something there that has no outermost aspect. Such a thing would not be in a full or complete state. No, it goes on until it reaches what is outermost. When it comes to its outermost point, it takes on a form there, uses substances that are gathered there to make itself whole, and becomes productive, which is accomplished by various forms of procreation. That is why the seedbed of heaven is on the outermost level. This is the meaning of what is said in the first chapter of Genesis about humanity and its creation. God said, "Let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness." And God created humanity in His image. In the image of God he created it, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 1:26, 27, 28. To create people in the image of God and in the likeness of God is to supply them with all the elements of the divine design from first to last, and thereby make them angels at the deeper levels of their minds. The reason the Lord rose from the dead not only spiritually but also physically is that when he was in the world he glorified his entire human nature, that is, made it divine. His soul, which he had from the Father, was the divinity in and of itself, and his body became a likeness of his soul, that is, of the Father, and therefore also divine. That is why he rose in respect to both soul and body, unlike anyone else. He also proved this to his disciples. They thought they were seeing a spirit when they saw him, but he said, See my hands and feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, because a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see I have. Luke 2400 hours 36, 37, 38, 39. In this way he showed them that he was human not only with respect to his spirit but with respect to his body as well. Several chapters of Heaven and Hell show in specific ways that heaven is not made up of angels created in the beginning, and that hell is not made up of a devil and his gang, but that both are made up exclusively of angels and devils who were born as human beings.